Here we go. Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us with Matthew Soerens, the U.S. Director of Church Mobilization for World Relief. We're so delighted that you guys are here. Hey, just as we've done before in all of our previous events, we have a Sli.do, which is right here, Sli.do Event number 207910. If you have any questions, please post them there. We'll take those at the very end. We were going to have about a 55-minute, who knows, maybe Matthew's going to share a lot more conversation. And then we'll take those questions at the end. Matthew, first of all, thank you so much for saying yes to us. Really appreciate you taking some time out. I'm sure things are busy with all the work that you're doing. So thank you so much for being here with our church.
Yeah, very, very happy to join you.
Okay, before we get into, I think, the bulk of the content of the book that you and your co-author Jenny have produced, I kind of am curious, who are you and what are you doing here? How did you get into this kind of work? And share with us a little bit about what World Relief is and your role within it, if you would be so kind.
Sure. So I guess I'll start with World Relief. World Relief was started back in the 1940s in response to the last great forced displacement crisis after World War II. And it was a church in Boston, Spark.Church, that basically wanted to come alongside churches in Europe and help with the rebuilding effort after the war. And what was originally War Relief, the War Relief Commission, eventually kind of morphed into a broader focus of not just conflict and war, but also poverty and other dynamics around migration, and became World Relief. So since then, our mission has been to empower the local church to serve the most vulnerable, whether that's in sub-Saharan Africa or Cambodia or Haiti or in the U.S. And in the U.S. in particular, we've been involved in resettling refugees since 1979. We're one of 9 organizations nationally that partners with the U.S. State Department. And we also serve a number of other immigrants of a variety of backgrounds, so not just those who come through the refugee program. My own introduction to these issues of immigration, in some ways, I'm probably sort of an unlikely person to be doing this work. I grew up in kind of small town in Wisconsin where we did not have ethnic diversity as far as I was aware. Like there was a British kid at my school, which we all thought was very exotic, but that was that was the only incidents of immigration that I can recall being aware of, which probably just means I wasn't looking very hard, but it definitely wasn't a major issue in our community or something people talked a lot about, except for that it was a political issue that we heard about on the news, cable news. This was before social media, which has only devolved the conversation around immigration. But where I really started thinking about these issues, I spent the summer volunteering in Costa Rica with a Christian organization in San Jose, Costa Rica. And I didn't really know what I was getting into, but it turns out mostly I was working with Nicaraguan immigrants, playing soccer with kids and leading Bible studies in broken Spanish. And one thing that I realized pretty quickly is that a lot of my Costa Rican friends had some strong opinions about Nicaraguan immigrants. They'd say things like, those people are responsible for all the crime in Costa Rica, or they're stealing our jobs, or they're lazy, which I never quite knew how those two went together. But, it really bothered me because these Nicaraguan families that I was interacting with, I mean, they weren't perfect people, but they were really normal people working incredibly hard in some of the hardest jobs imaginable. And I just remember talking to one of them at one point and saying, so why would you come here? And one of my friends said, well, Mateo, here we've got food on our plates. We've got a little bit of money to support our family, our elderly parents back in Nicaragua, and that's all we can hope for. And it really stuck with me. And then I came back to the United States, and I really feel like God convicted me that, I wasn't like an anti-immigrant zealot, but I had probably integrated some of those anti-immigrant ideas from television and radio into my own thinking without actually knowing any immigrants. And that really, I really intentionally in college wanted to get to know the immigrants in suburban Chicago where I was living. And eventually that led to volunteering with World Relief and then a job with World Relief where I've worked now for about 15 years. And at the same time, I also moved into an apartment complex right out of college where World Relief was resettling refugees, a lot of other immigrants as well. So immigration wasn't just an issue, it was also a very personal issue. These were my neighbors in a very literal sense. So that's kind of been where my passion for this issue, and really the policy issues and the biblical issues. I grew up in a great church, and I learned to love the Bible from the time I was a little kid. But I don't think I ever heard a sermon about how to treat immigrants or those were not the memory verses we memorized
Hmm.
growing up in Sunday school. And as I really personally wanted to understand how do I think about how to interact with my neighbors as a Christian, I went back to the Bible, and honestly, I felt a little gypped. Like, wow, there's so much
Mm.
here that is awfully specific about how to treat immigrants that
Mm.
somehow I just had this blind spot, which I think is a fairly typical blind spot for a lot of white evangelical Christians in particular, like my background. So that's kind of, I think my work now is largely focused on helping address that biblical blind spot and then applying that both to ways that churches and individuals within churches can serve the immigrants in their community and learn from the immigrants in their community, while also addressing some of the public policy issues
Yeah.
that are almost everyone agrees are fairly dysfunctional, but we don't all agree on why they're dysfunctional or what the solution is.
It's amazing in the answer you jumped right to the end. I was going to talk about theology at the very end, but I feel like you've summed it up right there. The biblical blind spot, which is one of the themes of your book that just comes through so loud and clear, and actually one of the things that I'd like to end with in the conversation, because it feels like, this particular issue, as you write about, has become so politically charged, but specifically Christians and evangelicals don't take their cues from a biblical narrative. They're taking their cues from their political identity or their political tribe.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating. Your account of World Relief, as well as your own experience, led me with two other questions. So World Relief is a decidedly Christian organization or a church-based organization?
It is. So we were founded by the National Association of Evangelicals, and they're still our parent organization.
Oh, wow. That's really fascinating, especially given that the word evangelical in our current sociopolitical context does not necessarily evoke the same connotations that might indicate that you would be under the banner of the National Evangelical Association.
Yeah, especially in the last 5 years, I think when I, make that connection, I feel like I need a little asterisk. And I think that, I love actually the work that the National Association of Evangelicals does. I mean, I don't think enough evangelicals are aware of,
Right.
For example, their approach to public policy, which is a very thoughtful, biblically rooted approach to issues like immigration and refugees and climate and poverty
Right.
and life and religious freedom and all these issues that doesn't fit into one political party's sort of platform.
Yeah.
But I also feel like I need sort of the asterisk to explain that when I use that term, especially in the last few years. I feel like the term has lost some of its historical meaning.
This was so not in my notes, but now I'm kind of curious. Do you then keep using the word evangelical when you are speaking publicly, especially maybe perhaps to an audience that you are maybe uncertain how that term is going to land and be received?
Yeah, I mean, I think I tried the kind of the Apostle Paul's all things to all people thing a little bit, not in a disingenuous way. I mean, my theology isn't shifting or my views on immigration policy aren't shifting. But if I'm talking to a decidedly evangelical church, I will probably remind them that World Relief was started by the National Association of Evangelicals.
Right.
If I'm talking to a more secular audience, I still want to bring my faith into conversation, but I sometimes find that term has so much baggage that people might not be able to understand where I'm coming from. So I'll talk more about, being a Christian or a follower of Jesus, and depending on the circumstance. And frankly, in a political sense, depending which member of Congress we're trying to meet with, it may or may not be a helpful term to drop as well. I mean, World Relief has been a part of something called the Evangelical Immigration Table that we're very proud to be a part of, and I helped to lead that effort with a lot of other really thoughtful people rooted in the evangelical tradition. But our positions on immigration, not all of them are out of step with evangelicals. You poll self-described evangelicals in the U.S. and their views are actually very nuanced. But there's some views that are definitely not where we are at World Relief. And I think that's disappointing. For example, on refugee resettlement, white evangelicals in particular, have become the only religious demographic of which a majority is opposed to refugee resettlement.
Right.
And I don't know how that happened exactly, but it's been a really disheartening thing to watch happen and in some ways be directly affected by.
Right. Yeah.
But there's still 40% who are supportive, and I think it's important to mention that as well, because those tend to be the churches we end up working with.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, all of these things are double-edged swords, and unfortunately, social media and the news and the headlines and stuff tend to skew our perspective. So I really appreciate you clarifying and helping to bring a really decidedly evangelical identity and approach to this particular topic, and just in your own personhood. You also mentioned while in Costa Rica that the rhetoric and the prejudice that was there against Nicaraguans sounded vaguely familiar to the rhetoric and the prejudice that we often hear about in American discussion and discourse. Am I close to real?
Absolutely.
And then my follow-up question with that is, how do you, I mean, that seems to be like a very fascinating data point, whereas a lot of the conversations that seem to be happening in America, it feels like, what is wrong with America? But if the rhetoric that you were hearing in Central America was, I mean, almost identical to the rhetoric that we're doing, then there's something deeper, I feel like, that is happening there that we can be enlightened with a deeper reflection upon that. So,
yeah, I mean, I don't want to excuse the United States because we definitely do have some unique issues, and yet we certainly don't own the market on xenophobia in the United States.
Right.
I mean, xenophobia is a lot older than the United States of America.
Right.
It's in the Bible. It's, this idea of being afraid of people who are different from you is a part of the human story in some unfortunate and really tragic ways. And, it's not that every country is the same. I think it's present in every country, but in different levels. And I also don't want to, I mean, there's amazing Ticos from Costa Rica who love Nicaraguan immigrants as well.
Right.
But I think that most Costa Ricans would acknowledge that the average view of a lot of Costa Ricans is somewhat negative towards Nicaraguans. And it's very similar rhetoric to what I grew up hearing sometimes about Mexicans in the United States.
Right.
And I mean, I really think it was God sort of getting my attention by bringing me out of my own context to kind of shake me and say, what you're hearing and probably taking into your own mind in some ways, whether on television or from, eventually social media, it's not a biblical perspective. It's not recognizing that these are people made in the image of God. It's also, it turns out, not even true. I mean, like, on its face, this group of people responsible for all the crime in this country clearly cannot be true. But not that different from the kind of hyperbole we hear about immigrants in the United States in some cases, or specific groups of immigrants.
Yeah. I mean, the data points to actually those claims being demonstrably false. I was listening to another person who has on a podcast earlier today where their specialty is criminology and kind of the criminal justice system. And they just blatantly said, look at the data. People who are immigrants or asylees are not even on the spectrum of the amount of crime that is being produced in America and being incarcerated. Although that may be different from a federal level because of our laws, as you mentioned in your book, which is what gets complicated when we have these conversations, because the laws on the books and how they're deployed would then yield quote unquote criminals because they've broken federal law. But we need to get there to help clarify that. So let's make sure we get there. I wanted to actually start with kind of a high level. This book, by the way, I should have showed it at the very top. I'm so sorry. Welcoming the Stranger: Justice, Compassion, and Truth in the Immigration Debate, with your co-author, Jenny Yang. Just in a wonderfully thorough book on this particular issue. I love books that are explanatory and educational rather than hyper polemicized or openly hostile, and decidedly non-emotional. Non-emotional meaning trying to be overtly manipulative emotionally. There's clearly emotion there because you tell some amazing stories of very real people and their lives. My question is, how do you enter into this debate, issue, conversation, when it feels like the vast majority of the people that are going to approach this are hyper polemicized, hostile, emotional? Because I feel like the approach that you have taken, and I'm presuming this is representative of World Relief as a general sense, that particular approach is going to be far more efficacious than kind of the virulent rhetoric that we often hear. And I mean, we're already mentioning some of it. Those people are lazy. They're stealing our jobs. They're producing all this crime, all that kind of rhetoric. But you and Jenny have really stayed away from that and just been very calm and explanatory. So I'm kind of curious, am I reading that correctly? What are the tools and practices, and is that a much more efficacious way of engaging with this kind of conversation?
Well, I'd have to leave to someone else to say if it's efficacious. I hope so, but it is definitely an intentional strategy. I think there's sort of three things that Jenny and we wrote the first edition of this book 2000. I mean, it came out 2009, so it was
Right.
quite a long time ago now. But even then, as we started putting the book together, we said there's probably three basic things we want to do with this book. One, we want to speak to Christians, for people for whom they would say the Bible's our authority, and keep going back to the Bible, which is in some ways an equalizer, because with all the political rhetoric, very little of it has anything to do with the scriptures.
Mm-hmm.
The second was we want to use the most unbiased sources possible for facts that are not, I mean, we can argue and we do have opinions on some of the policy questions or some of the more subjective discussions, but there also are just subjective facts here, whether that's like, well, here are the crime rates among immigrants, or here's what the vast majority of economists have said about this, which is not that every immigrant is, 100% great for the economy. It's more complicated than that, of course, but it is frankly that the net economic impact for the United States is positive, not to mention, of course, the impact on those immigrants. So looking at facts and, trying to provide as unbiased a perspective as possible. And the third thing is to bring in some stories. Again, not in a manipulative way, but I think it's very easy to hear a bunch of statistics and have that, some people love that and will grasp onto that, and that will be about all they need. Other people need to be able to picture this with a person in their mind. Mm-hmm. And both Jenny and I have been very blessed to have, lived in immigrant communities, have interacted through our work with World Relief with a lot of people who are sort of example cases of some of those statistics that we're sharing or how the legal system works. And I do think that helps people to develop some empathy with the situation of immigrants. And also, I mean, we're trying throughout this to have empathy for people who may disagree with us, who are also made in the image of God. Some of whom have some good points, some of whom I don't think it has as good of points, but are just working from a starting point that is mistaken, but not necessarily malicious. Mm-hmm. I mean, they just have, I'm sensitive to that because, again, that was me 20 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I had heard a lot of things on television, and I just presumed that they were mostly right, or at least partially right, and that guided me to a particular position.
Yeah. That strategy comes out loud and clear in the book. How does that change when you're actually in conversation with real people? The reason why I'm asking is because the people in our context are not going to write a book about this, but they are engaged. Like we have a beautiful community that will stand on the corner and hold a sign and have conversations with people because they really believe passionately about this. And I kind of want to know, is what you did in the book, how does that change, or how does that adjust when you're having conversations like in person, or you're out speaking with somebody who's hostile and, you know, giving all of those.
I think the challenge, whether it's with a book or just in our real lives, is to push beyond having those conversations with people who already agree with us, mm-hmm. which can be just natural geographically. I mean, there's lots of good data on the reality that we all tend to live among people who mostly think the same way that we do, and we tend to not know people who think dramatically differently. And I see that. I mean, I live now in a mostly Hispanic neighborhood in, suburban Chicago. And I've looked at the voting trends in my precinct. It was 90% for one candidate. Where my grandparents lived in rural Wisconsin, it was 90% for the other candidate. And so I've been in both those worlds, and sometimes, it takes work to translate the experience of one place to another. But I think most of us can think of some people, whether it's a relative or a friend, where we could find thoughtful ways to have those conversations across some of those divides, without the presumption that we're completely right and we're here to convert you to our point of view, but finding ways to dialogue. And obviously that can be true in immigration and a host of other issues as well.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. I really appreciate that posture and that tone, which is honestly a breath of fresh air to recognize in our very contentious socio-political climate that we find ourselves in. In recent years, there's been a lot of conversation in our culture regarding identity politics. Race obviously has been at the forefront of many people's minds. It's no surprise, but still intriguing that race, as well as you mentioned eugenics, have played a role in our immigration debate and discussion. And so I'd love for you to explain a little bit about how race and even eugenics, if you feel like that's important to point out, has played a role. You've even given some amazing quotes from previous presidents. Here it is. President Calvin Coolidge signed a Immigration Restriction Act of 1924 that, quote, America must remain American. And that, again, that rhetoric is, exacerbated in all sorts of different other ways and terms. So help us understand, how does race play a role in immigration thinking and politics and policies, and what really is kind of your response to that?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to acknowledge that historically race was very explicitly part of the conversation. There was races of people who were ineligible for citizenship at different points in our country's history. If you go back to our first restrictions on immigration, which is interesting because I come from a group of people, we're Dutch, where we came here 150 years ago, came here legally. We're very proud of that. But if you look a little deeper into why we came here legally, well, it's because we came in the 1850s when there was no restrictions on who could come to this country, at the federal level at least. That started to change, and that's not to say that immigrants were all popular and embraced by everyone, because you had these anti-immigrant sentiments going back to the very beginning. But in terms of policy, it was quite open until 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act.
That feels like a really important point. When people say that my ancestors came here legally, there's a reason why it was legal, and that is because
they could not have come illegally if they wanted to.
Right.
There's not a law to break.
Right.
And I'm not saying we should go back to that as our immigration policy today, but I do think it's important to acknowledge that before we brag about the moral superiority of of our ancestors, for those of us whose ancestors did come prior to 1882, or even really prior to 1924, because you were excluded if you were Chinese in the 1880s. Gradually, there was other categories who were excluded. And to your question, there certainly was a eugenics dynamic to that, for not all Americans who were supportive of those policies, but a significant number of them. And a lot of sort of the intellectual elites at that time were fully bought in on the idea of eugenics, which is, basically a sort of a pseudo-scientific racism, that, these ethnic groups are just biologically superior to these other ones. And they're going to therefore make better Americans that can understand democracy better. And basically it was Northern and Western Europeans were the preferred group races of people. That's one dynamic. The other dynamic, frankly, is a religious discrimination, and that comes to the reality that the first kind of wave of immigrants were largely Protestants from Northern and Western Europe. Then you started to get Catholics from Germany and Ireland and Italy, and Jews from Russia, and there was a lot of both anti-Semitism, but a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment as well. The whole Know Nothing movement was built. There was a eugenics dynamic to that as well, but it was also framed around these people are loyal to the Pope. They cannot possibly embrace a democratic form of government, which frankly, and I think I've heard John Fee from Messiah College say something very similar to this. It's almost word for word what some people would say about Muslims today. If you remove papists and put in Muslims, it's the idea that these people, because of their religion, it's there's nothing that can be done. They cannot become American. And we've had that attitude towards successive waves of future Americans, frankly, who turned out to make excellent Americans in time. But it's certainly eugenics is a part of our history, and one that would really, it's a little upsetting to read. But the hinge point for that was in the 1920s, where we basically went from, prior to the 1920s, there was restrictions on certain groups of people through the whole Ellis Island era, starting in the 1880s. But beginning in 1920, we said from now on, if you want to come to this country, you need a visa. You need permission from the U.S. government overseas before you get on the boat. And your eligibility for that visa was based on your country of origin, which obviously has some clear connections to race. And the quotas were based not on the 1920 census, which has just been completed, but on the 1890 census. So basically, we want the ratio of people from specific countries before all these Italians and Poles and Jews came. So sort of let's move back in time to reset the racial dynamics of the country to be what they were in 1890. And it became almost impossible to immigrate legally to this country for many parts of the world, especially the Eastern Hemisphere, beginning in the 1920s. And then that all changed again in 1965. So I don't think our laws are as bad now as they were in the 1920s. We've removed those elements that are specifically tied to country of origin, or at least primarily based on country of origin. But there still are dynamics that, are focus on people who have master's degrees favors, certain countries where more people have access to higher education and things like
Well, I
that.
was just going to ask about that because in many ways, the language or the structure of the laws might have changed or evolved, but fundamentally, the legal kind of premise is a vestige of that old racism. Is that not true, or do you really feel like there's been a shift in um, kind of a fundamental moral philosophy that's undergirding the legal structures that we've now put in place?
I mean, I would say our laws are less racist now. The 1965 laws, while probably not the intention of everyone who voted for it, they created opportunity for a lot
Hmm.
more diverse immigrants to come. And there was other things that happened after that. So the Refugee Act of 1980 established a system of asylum that not only was it possible to identify refugees abroad, and that has benefited, a large number of African refugees in particular, Middle Eastern refugees, some European as well, going back to the former Yugoslavia or former Soviet Union. Southeast Asia, the Burmese have been the largest group of refugees in the last few years. And then in 1990, the diversity visa lottery was added in, which has largely benefited African and Eastern European immigrants in recent years. That said, I actually had a colleague who works with us up in Washington State, did a really excellent piece in USA Today last year on the particular negative impact of some of the recent immigration policy changes under the previous presidential administration on Black immigrants in particular.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you shut off refugee resettlement, it turns out that was one of the primary ways that Africans could reach the United States lawfully. When you changed the rules for who qualified for asylum, again, that was a primary mechanism. When you use COVID as a pretext to basically shut down the diversity visa lottery, that was, Africans were much disproportionately likely to benefit from the diversity visa lottery than, let's say, from employment-based immigration.
So, as with most things, a mixed bag. There are some positive trajectories in some of the ways that the most recent acts in the last several decades have actually served as correctives, I suppose, to previously punitive acts that have been put forward. And at the same time, we've still got a lot of things that we're trying to work out. So yeah, I guess that makes a lot of sense.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
There's definitely been some progress, and I don't want to diminish that, but there's still a lot of long ways to go as well.
Yeah. I was reflecting on some of these dynamics and thinking that is there any perspective that we can gain from watching the European countries, specifically the Western European countries, having to deal with their own challenges as well? Specifically, I mean, several years ago, we were watching carefully the Syrian refugee crisis and the influx that was happening over there. Our church was involved in sending some people over to just try to learn and figure out. But the same identity issues, which includes race and ethnic identity and religious identity, seem to have been paralleled over there. I'm just kind of curious, is there anything that we can learn or understand? Because from my very ignorant perspective, not very well versed on all this, it feels like, this is very similar. I mean, once again, nobody's the only people that are xenophobic and have racial prejudice and stuff like that. But, France and Germany, they've had to deal with their own identity issues as well. And of course, with European history of the 40s, 30s and 40s, So I'm just kind of curious if there's anything that we can learn or any perspective that we can gain from watching what's happening over there.
Yeah, I mean, there certainly is. And I've had the chance to visit Germany as well. And the UK has some similar dynamics. I don't know that they're mostly positive lessons. I think there's probably some negative lessons. So I admire what Chancellor Merkel did in Germany with Syrian refugees, which was a different approach than the United States took, especially starting in 2017. I do think that, and there are lots of parallels. I mean, frankly, what the United States has done in recent years with our asylum system and Mexico is very similar to what the European Union has done with Turkey. Mm-hmm. Basically, our laws say if you get to our borders, you have the right to request asylum. So we will negotiate diplomatically with our neighboring countries to make sure they don't let anyone actually get to our border. Mm-hmm. And, there's a lot of parallels there. That said, I also think the U.S. has some unique advantages. And there are other countries, Canada would be a good example, that have this dynamic. But principally that to be American at its best, and we've certainly not done this perfectly in our history, but at its best, to be American is not a race or an ethnicity. Mm-hmm. Whereas to be French kind of is. I mean, you can you can be of African descent and naturalize in France. There's a possibility of that, but a lot of people will still never think of you as French, or Belgian or British. And again, not that we've done that perfectly in the United States, but at its best, it's possible to become American from any number of backgrounds. And we've seen that throughout our history. I mean, the people who were sort of the Italians who were viewed as inadequate at one point in our history are fully a part of the American story at this point, or the Irish, or the Germans going back far enough. And I think that's something we should lean into in the United States, in embracing that we can be a society that it has as a strength multiculturalism, that we have people from different backgrounds who do become fully American. But as they become American, this idea of integration is they bring a small part of who they are into the whole of what it is to be American. And we've changed our foods over time in this country. That's a good thing. Like, we sell more salsa than ketchup at this point. Salsa's a superior condiment. That's not.
Wait a second. You just said something very controversial there.
Well, and I guess the point is you can get both of those in the grocery store in the United States. Like, we have a lot more options because, that food is just one example. But our culture is enriched by the diversity of cultures that have come in through migration. And in Europe, they not only haven't always done that well, they haven't always tried to do that well. They have embraced a policy of sort of separation. Like, the Arabs will live here. Their job is to play a role in our economy. They don't want to become a part of us, and we don't want them to be part of us. At its best, and we're always pushing for the United States to do this better, we think the better model is integration, where the society that is receiving you embraces you and says you can become a part of us, and people want that, and they want to become American, which in my experience, we work with refugees who are, they're like more patriotic than anyone born in this country I've ever met, because they know what it is to be pushed out of a country and to be persecuted in their country of origin. And they tend to be incredibly grateful to the United States for giving them an opportunity. And I wish more Americans both knew that story and then were fully embracing of those individuals as well.
Okay, but Matthew, I'm losing my country. It's not our culture anymore. How do you have a conversation with somebody who will hear what you just said and not appeal to explicitly racist language per se, but will use terminology or ideas like, this is my culture, it's not my country, America has to remain American, very much like President Coolidge, What's your response to that? How do you convince, or how do you even dialogue with somebody who is at complete ideological opposite ends of what you just mentioned, that there's a richness to the diversity of America?
Yeah, I'd say a few things I would respond to that. One would be, I'm not saying that there's not something unique about America that we should embrace. We have the values of our Constitution of free speech and a free press and a democratic form of government. And in my experience, the vast majority of people who come to this country want those things. Freedom of religion, certainly. Which goes both ways, right? That means I have the freedom to share my faith with my Muslim neighbors, and they have the freedom to receive it or to reject it. We don't get to force that onto anyone, and that's part of the richness of our culture in the United States. Also, I would help. I think it helps sometimes with people who have that sort of I feel like I'm losing my country dynamic. If we can help build relationships. A lot of I go to a Spanish-speaking church. A lot of my conservative relatives in Wisconsin have a lot in common with the fairly socially conservative people in my church, who are probably a little bit more conservative than I am on a number of issues, because Central America is a largely Catholic and Pentecostal region, and it's people bring like a very strong family value ethic that I think actually a lot of Americans who tend to be afraid of immigration, if they knew the values that immigration was bringing, would actually be happy about it. Even just religiously. Again, we're really eager to welcome Muslim refugees, and we do so. But the reality is Muslims are a very small share of immigrants to the United States. The large majority in the U.S., which is a distinction from Europe, are coming from Christian backgrounds of one sort or another. They're more Christian in terms of like how often do you go to church than the average American is. And they bring a lot of that value with them to the U.S. But the last thing I would say on that, and this is where again, with a Christian audience in particular, I'd pivot back to the Bible, because the interesting thing about that sort of cultural change question is people are not wrong that their culture is changing a little bit.
Mm.
When they think that these immigrants are bad for the economy, they're just wrong, at least on the net. When they think that immigrants are bringing crime, they're mistaken. When they think that their culture is changing a little bit, they're not wrong. But from a biblical perspective, that's not a bad thing. I mean, we believe as Christians that we're headed for this future in Revelation 7, where it's every tribe and tongue and nation gathered around the throne. And if that sounds wonderful to you, the United States has the potential to have a small foretaste of that. If that sounds terrible, then I feel bad for people for whom that sounds terrible, because that's apparently where we're headed if we're followers of Jesus.
That's brilliant, Matthew. Well done. Well said. Now, I just kind of want to pause there because that was really well done. I really appreciate that. You also, in your book, have recognized that even though you made your stance clear regarding your policy and your theology about the welcome of immigrants, you're also not the abolish ICE folk as well. You're not like, well, let's just let everybody in, whoever wants to. You still say that there's a role in government. You still say and recognize that immigration is a complicated issue, that there are challenges and there are things that a sovereign nation, I suppose, needs to take care of. So what kind of, first of all, I guess, what kind of, I almost said concession, but it's not really a concession. It's a recognition that there are roles and places. And for, I suppose, the progressives in our audience, what would you say to them about what really is important or valued regarding an immigration policy, a border, all of those things, while at the same time still having a deeply just and compassionate immigration ethic?
Yeah. I think so often with the immigration debate, we have these kind of conversations where we're talking at each other and using terminology that the other side doesn't understand. In my experience, there's not a lot of Americans who think we should, have no regulation whatsoever of immigration. Anyone who wants to should be able to come in, and no one should ever be deported under any circumstance. I mean, we literally deport Nazis still. Like if we find that you were a Nazi and serving as like a guard in a concentration camp, you can be deported. And I think most people sort of think like, well, yeah, that's about the classic case of someone who has lost their privilege of being in the United States. If someone has murdered someone, I think that they have, and they're a non-citizen, that there's good reasons. And this is part of why crime is low among immigrants. I mean, there's good people coming, but also there are incentives not to commit crimes when you are not yet a citizen, because you could be deported. Sometimes I think very tragically for very minor things, but there are also major violent criminal offenses. The same with border security. To say we should have a secure border is not the same as saying we should have a closed border. My view is the United States government has an obligation, I think all countries do, to know who's crossing their border and to do everything reasonably possible to keep out someone who is seeking to do harm. And the vast majority of people coming to the United States are not seeking to do harm. But there's a few who are or who could be. And I want our government to do that vetting and that process. I mean, we receive refugees at the airport. I've had refugees live in my home for months at a time. And I have a lot of confidence that they've been vetted by the U.S. government. They're not the people whom the refugees are fleeing from, whether that's ISIS or, a corrupt government of some sort. They're the victims of that. And I just have a lot of confidence in our government's vetting process because I've worked with it. And, if anything, I've seen people who I think should have gotten through who didn't. But they err on the side of caution for sure. And for the most part, that's appropriate. I mean, we want there to be I think my general view is we want good laws that can be fully enforced. The problem in my view is right now, instead of adjusting our immigration legal system that might have made a lot of sense back in 1965, or even going back to the last major immigration reforms in terms of changing our visa system, or in 1990, we've gotten to the point as a country where there's sort of this looking the other way as people either cross the border unlawfully, or that happens a lot less now, but overstaying a visa or staying in the country with a kind of marginal asylum case, although there certainly are very real asylum cases as well. And the reality is our economy needs those people's work. So rather than changing the number of immigrant visas, making it easier to come to this country legally, which is the best single thing you could do to reduce illegal immigration, is have a robust legal immigration process. Right. And when people are opposed to that, it sort of begs the question, are you really against illegal immigration or are you against immigrants?
Right.
And actually, frankly, one of the things that we saw in the last few years is a more honest conversation that a pretty significant minority of Americans just actually would rather there not be any more immigrants coming to this country. I mean, that was a proposal in the U.S. Senate a few years ago that was supported by the White House to dramatically reduce legal immigration, not illegal immigration, but legal immigration. And that has roots in kind of a population control movement that there's just too many people in this country, which is, I mean, the counterpoint to that is our birth rates are actually very low right now, and most economists think that that's a problem, not a good thing. But I think that if we genuinely have the position that legal immigration is a good thing, it's better to happen legally than illegally, then we need to have more robust legal immigration options.
Thank you for that. You alluded to the previous administration. Without getting into the weeds of politics, I think there is a sense that the last several years of the presidential administrations have kind of thrown this particular topic into, shall we say, a cultural hot mess of trying to navigate what seems to have been coming from the White House and then the shift. But even the previous administration before that was known as exporter, in chief. So for those who are paying attention to presidential politics and kind of the government as a whole, is there any perspective that you can offer us, get us grounded for when there's those administrative changes at the presidential level, and or can you give us some insights as to specifically, we have a new administration now. What are some things that we need to be paying attention to, even with that particular shift?
Yeah. I mean, immigration is a policy area where the president actually has a lot of authority. I mean, there's a lot of things that a presidential candidate will promise that actually he or she has no ability to change unless Congress goes along with them. And we're seeing that on lots of other issues. That's true for some issues on immigration. For example, basically the president can't give anybody citizenship or a green card. But there are a lot of areas where the president has a lot of authority. And we saw that with the Trump administration, I would say most notably with cutting down refugee resettlement. It went from President Obama had set the ceiling for refugee resettlement and was basically on track towards this goal of 110,000 for fiscal year 2017. That got cut by more than in half within the first week of a new administration. And by the end of the Trump administration, that ceiling was at 15,000. Last year, even with a slightly higher ceiling, it was only about 11,000 or 12,000 refugees who came in. And this comes, I mean, if you go back not that far in our history, 1980, there was 200,000+ refugees resettled in the United States. So, I think those changes are very real. And at World Relief, we're one of the agencies working with those people and frankly, telling their relatives here in the United States that we don't know when your sister's going to be able to come or when your wife's going to be able to come. We've been working and praying for this lovely woman in Spokane, Washington for years now, a Pakistani Christian persecuted for her faith in Pakistan, made it out to Sri Lanka. Her husband, after being tortured, made it out as well. She's now here, has been here for several years, and we don't know when her husband might be able to come. And, I think that can change with the presidential administration, but it's also not automatic. I mean, President Biden ran on restoring the refugee ceiling. He said he was going to put it at 125,000. I was really appreciated his rhetoric about refugees during the campaign, and then a few months ago he signed an order, basically sustaining the refugee ceiling at 15,000 for the rest of this fiscal year, which was like a gut punch to us because, I mean, we were disappointed and really upset when President Trump did what he did with the refugee ceiling, but it was a campaign promise kept. With President Biden, he put his name next to the same refugee ceiling, the same historically low refugee ceiling as President Trump. Now, there was enough pushback on that he changed it a few weeks later, and now it's set at 62.5 for the rest of this year. There's still a lot of challenges there because the reality is the Trump administration wasn't sending the officers to the field to vet people that in this kind of process that can take a year or more. So it's going to take a good year or more to really get back to historically normal refugee resettlement levels. But I do think some of the right changes are happening now, and we're going to keep our eyes on that because, For us, it's not about what letters behind the president's name
Right.
or even about their campaign statements. President Biden just put out a lovely World Refugee Day statement. I commend it to all of you. But frankly, it doesn't mean that much if it's not backed up by actual policy changes.
Yeah, I appreciate that. The diligence that we as citizens have to have is pretty high. We have to be diligent, and I think we are susceptible to, the campaign rhetoric, and then so we get activated or we get blasé depending upon what is said or isn't said. But it does take some diligence for us to pay attention to that. Okay, in our time left, I'd like to talk theology because we are a Christian audience, and I think what you mentioned is grounding ourselves in our biblical narrative and our theological convictions, ultimately our allegiance to Jesus, really needs to be the informative way forward, at least for us. I know you speak in probably multiple kinds of contexts, but for us, that's really important. So I'd like to explore some of that and help provide a robust response for the Christians that are watching. And then we have several questions that have come in regarding now what do I do, which is always the question that we'd like to end on. So you have this quote from theologian Orland Espin, if I said his name correctly: welcoming the stranger, the immigrant, we would say today, is the most often repeated commandment in the Hebrew scriptures, with the exception of the imperative to worship only the one God. And the love of neighbor, especially the more vulnerable neighbor, is doubtlessly the New Testament's constant command. Whatever the cause of immigration today, there can be no doubt as to where the church must stand when it comes to defending the immigrant. True or false statement? No, I'm totally kidding. My question is that seems to be, I don't want to say clear, but it seems to be very well supported and articulate throughout the scope of the biblical witness. But I'm sure you've heard some counter theologies to that. So I'm kind of curious, what are some counter theologies to that statement or that general idea, and how have you responded to them?
Yeah, there's a few pushbacks. One I would say is I wish there was more counter theological push and not just like cable news talking points. I mean, often when I go to a church, there's always great people who have great questions, but to the extent that there's some hostility, the questions are rarely about the Bible. It's rarely a disagreement about how we've interpreted Romans chapter 13 and being subject to governing authorities. It is almost always, but why don't they learn English? Or, but what about crime? What about gangs? What about, can we afford this? And without the veneer of like a biblical justification. I mean, even if loving immigrants is not in our economic interests, we're still called to love our neighbors. And immigrants are very explicitly included in that neighbor definition, even going back to Leviticus 19. That said, occasionally I do get kind of a theological counter argument. One would be, and there's a respected biblical scholar at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, James Hoffmeyer, who tries to make the argument that all of the verses in the Old Testament that Orlando Espin references, specifically those that reference the Hebrew word ger, which is the kind of the resident. Well, here's his debate. Most scholars would say the ger was a resident foreigner, someone from another country who comes and resides in another, which basically is the English word for an immigrant, or is that's how that would be the best translation for that. Hoffmeyer basically makes the argument that this was a legal immigrant, and that all those commands of God to the people of Israel we shouldn't apply them to someone who's not legally in the United States. There's plenty of other biblical scholars. Daniel Carroll at Wheaton College, I think, is the one who I find just, I think really addresses that very head on. There's also a scholar up at Regent in Vancouver who's got a really excellent new book called Refugee Reimagined that Mark Glanville is his name. He also looks at that and I think makes a very compelling argument that Dr. Hoffmeyer is mistaken in sort of that interpretation. But people should read it for themselves. There's books on all these topics. I'm not a theologian, so I kind of punt on that and say, well, then let's just talk about the New Testament, because frankly, you don't even need the 92 references to the Hebrew ger to get to this conclusion in the New Testament that we're called to love our neighbors. And it's pretty clear in Jesus' story of the Good Samaritan that we do not have the option to narrowly define who our neighbor is. The other argument I think I get is, well, that's good for individuals, we should be nice to people. We should welcome immigrants as churches and individually, but you can't apply that to government. And there's some, I don't want to say, I don't know if I'd say there's truth to that, but it is true that the role of the church and the role of the individual is distinct from the role of the government. I will affirm that we have, God has ordained government. We see that in Romans 13 and elsewhere for a purpose, to maintain order. And that's part of why, at World Relief, we haven't said we should just have amnesty, where someone broke the law, but we're just going to ignore it and, extend grace. On an individual level, the scriptures are pretty clear. I have received grace. I have received divine amnesty, and I ought to be very generous with forgiveness to others. But clearly, we can't just say that applies to every government, that they must forgive every offense, or we could have no order. I mean, we could, if you can't punish someone if they commit a very serious crime because we must always forgive, order it goes to chaos. So the question is, well, what's an appropriate penalty for a violation of an immigration law, which is not the sort of violation of law that is inherently, malicious, or it is, in legal ethics, you talk about things that are malum prohibitum versus malum in se. So things that are sort of bad because we say they're bad versus things that are just inherently vile, evil, murder or rape or that sort of thing. Breaking an immigration law, crossing a border unlawfully, is bad because we drew a line there. And that doesn't mean the line's illegitimate. We have to have some degree of order. It's like a speed limit. Speed limits have a good purpose, and they lose their meaning when we don't enforce them. And where I live in Chicagoland, everyone sort of decides for themselves if you can go 10 miles over the speed limit or 15 or 20. I'm the one who thinks you can go 10, but I judge the people going 20 over. When we're all making the rules for ourselves, it doesn't make much sense. So I think actually it's good to have good, just laws and then to have reasonable enforcement measures. And I think the scriptures can guide us prudentially in how we get to some of those things. I'm never going to claim, if you read the Bible backwards 4 times, you're going to find out how many refugees God thinks should come to the United States. There's not a magic number right. That is the biblical number of refugees. But, for a country that has proven we can take in 100,000 refugees quite easily, I think we ought to do so. Yeah. That it's been in our own interest, in addition to, a part of our humanitarian character as a nation. I think we should push for a higher number, especially when we have some moral culpability. The situation in Afghanistan is probably the most clear example of that I can think of. Yeah. When we pull troops out of Afghanistan, there are going to be a lot of people at risk because of their association with the United States. Yeah. And I think we have some moral responsibility there. Yeah. But, I don't want to overstate the case for public policy changes. I've got lots of opinions, and I think they're consistent with biblical principles. But I also don't want to say, this is Jesus's favorite immigration bill, because inherently we're going to be doing our best to prudentially determine how do we apply that principle of loving our neighbor or showing particular concern for those who are vulnerable to issues of public policies when we bring our faith into our role as citizens.
That's always a trepidatious endeavor because the conviction, if you're a Christian, you have this religious faith conviction about the ger, about the stranger, about loving your neighbor, but you have to stop short of saying this bill Jesus would sign. And that is a tension that I don't think we're ever going to resolve. And yet somehow we have to kind of live with that and navigate that reality. Yeah.
And I also think inevitably the bill that I'm going to want, hopefully President Biden to sign is going to include some things I don't like. Like that is the nature of politics.
Politics. Yeah.
And frankly, it's frustrating to see sort of the perfect become the enemy of the good. I mean, if there was both Republicans and Democrats who helped kill the effort back in 2013, that was it was 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats got together. I didn't love everything about the bill, but had it passed and been signed by President Bush, and frankly, if a previous effort back in 2006 would have passed and been signed by President Obama in 2013, signed by President Bush in 2006, either of those bills had things I didn't like. Mm-hmm. But in my mind, there's no question they would have been net positive improvements to our immigration system and have saved just a lot of human suffering in the last 10 or 15 years.
Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciate that. It's always, I find myself completely in a quandary regarding that because politics is not a perfect science, never will be. And so you can have your core convictions and values, and then as soon as you try to implement them in a political structure such as ours, you're going to run into some problems. And so I mean, I'm hearing from you in that particular sense that there is some level of concession, a lot of humility, and grace, and just kind of acceptance to that reality as you move forward in trying to get either incremental or larger steps than that moving forward, right? Um,
Yeah, I think that's right. And at the same time, it has never been my sole job or mission to change policies. I want policies to change because I think there's a lot of injustice in our immigration system that I think policy could help to change. But I also want, that love your neighbor part on a very interpersonal, on the ground level. I want Christians to be faithful to those commands, to show kindness to people who are new in their community,
yeah.
and to recognize that God has a purpose in migration, that those people can be a blessing, and so often are. And I think in some ways, whether or not the government gets their part right, I want the church to get its part right.
This is one of my favorite parts of the book. On page 95 and 96, you write, to many North American ears, to, quote, do justice implies law enforcement, whereas to act justly implies doing what is right and fair. We believe the latter, we being you and Jenny, we believe the latter understanding is closer to the justice that God calls us to. And then just one page later, you write, with the exception of employing someone who is undocumented and not authorized to work, which is quite clearly unlawful, none of the ways that a church as an institution or an individual Christian would interact with undocumented immigrants is against the law. There is no legal requirement or expectation that a citizen report someone they suspect might not be lawfully present in the country. This was really poignantly clear, because so much of our conversation is in policy. We're living in a government, we have a particular presidential administration, and so there's these things that get us outraged and get us engaged and involved at the policy level and the government level. But as you were just mentioning, and then as the quote in the book, we can do this now. We can love our neighbor now. Yeah.
And so often that is like a revelation to a lot of the church leaders I interact with, because they're like stressed out about, well, we want to follow the law, but we want to show love and kindness to immigrants, and we want to share the gospel, and which should we do? And my answer is yes, follow the law and show love and kindness to immigrants. And there's not a tension there. There could be if you wanted to employ them, but that's not usually what you're asking about. You're asking about, can they come to our food pantry? Can they, can we baptize them? Can we serve them communion? Can we share the gospel with them? Can we teach them Sunday school, or let them teach Sunday school to us? Again, as long as it's not a paid gig. There's no legal issue there. And there are times when these questions of civil disobedience come up. I'm not saying that, I'm not someone who believes that Paul's instruction to the church in Rome and in Romans chapter 13 mean that we must always and should always obey a government, no matter how unjust the law may be. But frankly, most of the time, we don't hit that question with immigration in terms of how does a citizen interact with immigrant neighbors? And that could change. Laws could change. We've been close to that at different points in the last few decades. But the status quo right now, and even through the last several years, there's not really this tension point. And I almost think we use it as an excuse sometimes to say, oh, well, there's a verse somewhere in Romans that says, be subject to the governing authorities, and those people are here in violation of law, therefore we should not go near them. Well, if you're going to take Romans 13 seriously, then you've got to read the Immigration Nationality Act, which I don't wish upon anyone, because I've got my copy on the bookshelf here. It's thicker than the Bible and far less interesting. But the good thing about it is it doesn't have all that much to say to a church as an institution, or to a U.S. citizen who is not subject to most of those immigration laws. And it certainly doesn't say you have to report someone whom you suspect of being here unlawfully.
Right.
That's not an obligation that's part of our laws.
Yeah, you mentioned civil disobedience. When I read that quote, I was very grateful for it. But then I also thought of there was a New York Times article on a Christian group called No More Deaths, and they were arrested for providing food and water for the migrants through the desert. So they were arrested, they were tried, they were eventually let go. But there is that... I kind of felt like even in that statement that there's nothing that a church or an individual can do as a Christian based upon their religious conviction to love their neighbor. There are those occasional examples where civil disobedience is going to have to come into play.
There could be. In some ways, I think that case, which was troubling, we hadn't seen a prosecution like that in at least a long time. but that it was not, they weren't convicted. Ultimately, sort of the First Amendment won the day. Like, this is an exercise of your religious faith, and the government should not be infringing upon it. Yeah. So I think the judge made the right decision in that case. But again, we're not promised in the scriptures that the government will never come after you for doing the right thing. Right. I mean, tell that to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or or the Apostle Paul, who wrote Romans 13 and also spent a good part of his ministry in jail on the wrong side of the law.
That's right.
So clearly there are times, I think Romans 13 is certainly true in general, except for we are to be subject to government authorities. We don't have the privilege of just dismissing laws we find inconvenient. But if it's conflicting with a law of God, we may need to consider civil disobedience, or I think Shane Claiborne reframes it as, it's not civil disobedience as much as it is divine obedience. Like, that needs to be what takes precedent. Yeah. And I think that's a helpful way to frame it. Yeah. But again, I don't want to confess to any crimes, on a recorded thing, but I don't think that I break laws in my work with World Relief. Like, certainly, like, the ministries that we do are all legal. I mean, when I give someone legal advice, which was my former role with World Relief, I'm not helping them break a law. I'm telling them, this is what the law says. These are the options available to you under the law. Yeah. When I have some of my neighbors, some of my friends from church who are undocumented over for a meal, I'm not violating the law. If ICE came to the door and I lied to ICE, I might be liable for harboring. But frankly, that just hasn't happened, and I'll think about what to do if that does happen. Right. But
yeah. I don't know if you've heard of Esau McCaulley in his book Reading While Black, but he takes a whole other kind of approach to the Romans 13 that also provides some additional theological perspective there. So just a note to our audience, we got to interview him a while back, and that was really wonderful. Okay, I need to bring this to a close and get to some of the questions. I just want to close. I wanted to give you the last word, which is actually the biblical last word. Page 145, you write, "Indeed, as Christians, we must be wary of valuing persons solely on the contributions they can make to our affluence," which is such a great, that line just hits, because it feels like much of the conversation is just so much, well, what's in it for me, rather than the biblical conviction. You go on to write, "We should also recognize their inherent dignity as a person made in God's image, Genesis 1:27. As well as the personal and cultural contributions they can make to our country. If our measuring stick of success is affluence, we become blinded to or devalue the blessings God has poured on us in other forms," page 145. And it feels to me like what you have done in this book, you mentioned the social psychology of network of associations and how we respond to those kind of associations rather than the facts. It's just really thorough. We didn't get to all of the stuff that I wanted to talk about, but the reason why I wanted to close there is because it feels to me like one of the, and you mentioned this earlier in the conversation, that one of the primary objectives is to help Christians actually become more evangelical, become more Christian, become more committed to the faith that they claim, because it is out of that faith identity and conviction that their whole perspective and view on the stranger and the immigrant and the asylum seeker ultimately changes. Did you want to, I just wanted to say that, because if that's what I got from the book, it just felt like, can we just reground ourselves in the very faith identity that we claim to have?
Yeah, well, I'm glad. That's certainly what we're trying to do with the book. We did this survey some years ago, probably 2015, and found that we asked self-described evangelical Christians, and this was Lifeway Research did the survey for us, but they asked, what's the most important influence on your thinking about immigration? Yeah. And among evangelical Christians, only 12% managed to say the Bible, which is sort of like the right answer, right? They warned us in developing the survey, if you ask evangelical Christians and one of the choices is the Bible, they're all going to check it no matter what the question is. But not apparently when you ask what forms of views on immigration. The Bible, the local church, and the views of national Christian leaders, those three options combined, it came up less often than the media. Yeah. And that's not that all media is evil. There's better and worse, but it's not going to enrich your perspective as a follower of Jesus. And so that's, I don't necessarily want everyone to have to agree on the exact same immigration policy, but for those of us who profess to follow Christ, my hope is that we can start the conversation in that same place of saying, what does God's word say on this, and how does that inform both how we interact with our neighbors and how we approach these questions of public policy?
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, we're going to go to Sli.do. Thank you, everybody, for your comments. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of them, but it's been wonderful. There's some clarifications and some plus ones. Um, and some other quotations in the comments that have been really wonderful. Here's the first number one upvoted question from the Sli.do that you all submitted. Thank you so much. What do you suggest we do at the border to make our immigration process more humane, more compassionate? What do we do, Matthew?
Yeah, I mean, the border's always been really challenging, and it's gotten more challenging in recent years. One dynamic that I think most Americans seem to have missed is that we've had this significant shift where it used to be that most people were trying to sneak across the border and, and find a job and fit into the American economy. Now, most people who show up are looking for the Border Patrol because they want to request asylum. That doesn't mean they all qualify for asylum. Some of them, I think, should. Some of them really don't have a very good legal case. They're fleeing poverty, which I'm sympathetic to, but that doesn't qualify you for asylum under our laws in itself. And others have kind of gray cases, or, they might win if they have a good lawyer. One thing that I think we should do, certainly, is we should have more opportunities for legal immigration that are accessible closer to home. That is to say, people come to the border to seek asylum after an incredibly dangerous trip across Mexico. And again, these are mostly Central Americans, not Mexican nationals, which is another shift in the last 15 years. They would much rather go to the consulate in their country of origin, or maybe even a neighboring country, and say, hey, I'm fleeing this situation. Can you verify that and then bring me on an airplane? And, that is basically the refugee resettlement process. In fact, people pay back their plane tickets. It's not a free pass. They get a loaned plane ticket. It's much more orderly. It's much safer for those individuals. And, I think that it would be much preferable to have expanded legal options, both for those fleeing persecution, like refugee resettlement, but also for those really fleeing poverty when there are needs in the American economy, which there certainly are right now. I mean, agriculture in California alone is desperate for more workers, not to mention many other sectors of our economy. The other thing I think we need to do is address our asylum system. And part of the reality is it can take years to see an asylum case through to its completion. And that's not fair to those who have legitimate asylum claims because they're in this limbo for years. Yeah. Frankly, it's also, it makes it such that when a smuggler tells someone, if you get to the United States, you might get to stay, it might feel like that's working when you've been here 3 years waiting for your asylum hearing. You might still get deported eventually. And I'm not saying we should deport people. I'm against the idea of using Border Patrol officers as asylum officers because they're not trained for that. And people need a little time to develop their cases, but they don't need years. So, having more asylum officers, more immigration judges in some cases would be a much better way to do this. The other question is, what do you do with people while they're waiting for their hearing? And what has happened in the United States, and this is true under President Obama, it's true under President Trump, it's still true under President Biden in many cases, is sometimes asylum seekers will be let go, basically to wait for their hearing in the United States, often living with family, usually with an ankle bracelet around their ankle to make sure they show up for court. But often they're detained, and that's especially true for adults without children. World Relief does some ministry in a detention facility outside of Seattle. We basically run church services in that detention facility. But some of those individuals, they show up, they never broke any law. They went to the port of entry and said, I'd like to request asylum. When they're eventually allowed in, they're put into a detention center, and they can wait there for months or even years waiting for their asylum hearing, which is not only just it's an incredible waste of taxpayer dollars when there's no reason to think those people are a public safety threat in any way, but it's incredibly inhumane. You have people fleeing persecution for their faith, people fleeing persecution for political activism in countries where there are authoritarian regimes. So, using alternatives to detention would be another thing I would do. And the last thing is, there's a lot that the U.S. could do to address the situations that people are fleeing in the first place. That's not an easy thing to fix, but there are, a lot of the issues in Central America are rooted in corruption. And the U.S. has some ability to address some of those situations. There's good ministries and organizations that, I'm not saying just give a check to the corrupt, government of the other country, but organizations, one of my favorite organizations is ASJ, the Asociación for una Sociedad Más Justa in Honduras, does incredible work, and they were doing more work with help from USAID till the Trump administration, sort of as punishment to Honduras for letting people leave their country, cut off foreign assistance. And that, World Vision lost funds, IJM lost funds, Catholic Relief Services lost funds, and the net effect is some of what we're seeing now, with more desperation-fueled migration from Central America. I want the U.S. church, I want our country to welcome people, and as many as we can and as humanely as we can. But I think it's a tragedy whenever people feel like they have no choice but to leave their home.
Yeah.
And we should do everything we can to address that.
Yeah, that just sounds like insane making to cut off funds and support and resources to organizations that are on the ground attempting to make people's lives better.
Yeah.
Because that seems to, I mean, that just makes sense. That's going to exacerbate the problem. So this question came to mind while you were talking. Do you know anything about Vice President Harris's trip and whether or not that kind of is an attempt to address that last point that you were making there?
It is, and I think it's smart to be addressing that. I felt a little bad for the vice president because she got a lot of flack for, like, why aren't you at the border? I mean, there are things that need to happen at the border, but it doesn't just need to change at the border. I mean, it also needs to change in Central America.
Right.
And the U.S. cannot solve that unilaterally. It's not a matter of just if we put enough money there, everything is resolved.
Yeah.
But there are things the U.S. government can do, and from friends and colleagues who work in Central America, they're encouraged by some of what the Biden administration is proposing. There's still a lot more to do, and some of that will probably require Congress as well. And there's an important role for the church in those countries as well in holding their own governments accountable also.
Yeah.
But some of these problems have roots in the United States also. So our foreign policy, our trade policies have an impact also.
Yeah. Okay. Your other Sli.do questions. Thank you for advocating for reform at a national level. What are some levers of power at the local level that we can pull to bring change locally too?
Well, you're ahead of the curve in California, frankly. You're, the rest of the states are kind of following California's lead for the most part. Although I shouldn't presume that everybody there is in California either, because people could be all over.
Yeah.
I think one of the questions is, again, and California has led the way on this, is how does local law enforcement interact with federal immigration enforcement? That obviously gets very controversial. It gets labeled a sanctuary policy, which I find that term really unhelpful because I think people don't understand what that term means. I mean, there's no legal definition of what that term means. There's no arbiter of what a sanctuary jurisdiction is. But at its best, what it means is that local law enforcement who do not have the resources to enforce immigration law any more than they do tax law, leave that to a different part of the government. And that also builds trust so that when people are victims of crime, they call the police. And when they're witnesses to crime, they call the police. And the absence of those policies where people are afraid that they might get asked about their legal status is people don't call the police. Right. And actually, we see, it's true that immigrants commit crimes at lower rates than native-born U.S. citizens. It's harder to determine, it's hard to find hard data on this, but it's also probably true that immigrants are victims of crimes at higher rates than native citizens. And a lot of that goes to being afraid to report when they're, when they are victims or when they're witnesses. It's hard to recruit people to testify in court to get a conviction when they're afraid that someone might ask them about their legal status. So that's something states and local governments have done, and California has. Driver's license is another big issue. And when we did that in Illinois, probably 5 or 6 years ago now, I mean, I felt like it was like my little personal ministry was to be called out at midnight by some of my Mexican undocumented neighbors when they'd been pulled over by the police in our town, which had this reputation for pulling people over for reasons that I would never get pulled over for. Yeah. Like one of my neighbors got pulled over for having the rosary beads in his rearview mirror, which is technically against some statute, at the local level, some municipal code. I just have a hard time thinking I would get pulled over for that. Yeah. But of course, once he's pulled over for that, he's driving without a license because he was not eligible for a license. My job was basically to go pick up his car. So in addition to facing a big fee for driving without a license, he didn't have to also pay to get his car out of the towing lot. That changed in Illinois a few years back, and it's changed in a handful of states, but most states still, it's not possible to be licensed without valid immigration status.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, let's see if we can do a couple rapid fire. What do you propose as a counter narrative to the idea that the U.S. should prioritize letting in quote unquote good, read educated, productive, ambitious immigrants?
I guess it gets really hard for the U.S. to predict who's going to be a good, productive immigrant. It turns out some of our largest companies were founded by people brought here as refugees, as children. Google, for example, not because Sergey Brin was brilliant as an 8-year-old, but because he was fleeing with his family anti-Semitic persecution. World Relief, we just had someone, I think they're in Central California, who was a similar story. Came from as a refugee, started this now $1 billion company. Also, I think on a humanitarian and moral level, if we go back to the Bible, if we believe that every person is made in the image of God, our obligation to people is to protect human life, regardless of whether or not they're going to somehow pay it back, even if they likely will.
Yeah, I'm very much on board with the theological and philosophical idea. These are people. We treat people with humanity. We treat people as they are the image of God. But it's also, in addition to that, seems like such a stupid thing. Sorry to say the word stupid, but the potential that we have lost out on as a result of the oppression of other peoples, because people are the number one resource. And can you imagine what kind of gifts and blessings could have been? So,
and that in itself goes back to being made in the image of God. These are people made in the image of a creator.
Yeah.
And we forget that when it's not just, they have dignity, let's protect their lives. It's also, what are we missing out on if we don't let that potential flourish?
Yeah. Okay, 2 more questions, Matthew, and then we'll let you go because it's starting to get late. What is the biggest promoted lie about immigration?
Oh, there's many. I think the one that is most persistent is around the economics. There's this idea that immigrants are bad for the economy, that we can't afford to help bring in more immigrants because that somehow costs us. Almost no economists think that's true. Yeah. 96% of the economists surveyed by the Wall Street Journal think that illegal immigration in particular has a net positive impact on the U.S. economy.
Yeah. And last question, what other books would be helpful for people new to the immigration conversation?
Oh yeah, and so many, and I won't move my computer to show you my stack of books.
Yeah, I think I have the Refugee Reimagined up here somewhere.
Yeah, Refugee Reimagined, I actually did the foreword to, and great book, kind of deep theological book. It's by Mark and Luke Glanville. Another book that World Relief was a part of that I really valued, again, also from a Christian perspective, is called No Longer Strangers. It's edited by Eugene Cho and Samira Page, and actually Jenny Yang, my co-author for Welcome the Stranger, has a contribution there. I did another book with 2 other World Relief colleagues a few years ago, specifically on refugees, called Seeking Refuge. My colleague Karen Gonzalez, who's also with World Relief, has a great book called The God Who Sees. It's sort of both her personal, sort of one part memoir, one part biblical theological reflection. That's probably enough. That's several.
Well, at the very least, start with this one. Welcoming the Stranger, revised and expanded. Yeah, it's amazing that you published this over 10 years ago now and had some new ones. So this is fantastic. Matthew, your this book and your voice, along with Jenny and World Relief, is just an incredibly measured, thoughtful, theologically grounded voice in this whole thing. And I'm personally tired of the vitriolic rhetoric and people screaming and yelling at each other, and then of course being uneducated. Like they'll just say things because it's a nice talking point rather than being really thoughtful about it and thinking, for example, like the economic questions, like, well, let's ask the question whether or not that's really true. Let's ask the crime question. Let's ask rather than just using it kind of as a rhetorical cudgel, against other people. So thank you for being that voice. And thank you so much for spending some time enriching us and helping us and being a part of the conversation and contributing to the advocacy and the work that our church I'm so proud of our church and the people that are loving people in our community who we happen to be in touch with, who are asylum seekers and refugees. And so thank you to my community. Shout out to Spark.Church for being those kinds of people. We are just one spark in the midst of a whole bunch of other people in this area that are doing that work. So I'm just so grateful. So Matthew, thank you so much. You're amazing.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been a privilege.
Okay. Good night, everybody. And this video, of course, is going to live in perpetuity on YouTube. So please feel free to share it and tweet about it. Whatever, I don't know, whatever all you social media savvy people do, just go ahead and do that and get the word out and help other Christians, evangelicals, people of faith engage with this kind of compassion and justice. So have a good night, everybody. We'll see you next time. Bye.